Hello. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 11, Artistic Styles in the Emerging Modern World, circa 1400 to 1800. Now again, like the previous chapter, this is a large chunk of time. We're going to go about 400 years, and a lot of things happened within this time period. So again, we are mainly going to hit the highlights and focus on the Western world. But just like in the other chapters, we will start with the context so we get an idea of what's going on in the world. So in Europe, we have some major events in this time period. We have the Renaissance from 1400 to about 1550, and we'll discuss this in more detail later on. But what happens with the Renaissance? We're moving out of the Middle Ages, out of the Gothic. And what happens is we have a rebirth in the understanding of human beings. And what happens is that those texts of ancient Greece and Rome that had been lost during the Middle Ages make their way back over to the Western world. And because of this, we're going to see this new resurgence in the interest in the role of man. This largely centered in Florence. In fact, Florence called itself the New Athens. And the role of man changed from what we saw in the Middle Ages. Remember, the Middle Ages, there was the claim that the mortal world was this vale of tears that man must suffer through to get to the salvation of the afterlife. Well, the Renaissance, that idea changed, and man starts to focus more on himself. And in this, we see the rise of what's called humanism. And this is the focus on human potential and not a focus on divine inspiration. Some important inventions during the time is we have Gutenberg's movable type printing press in 1450, which makes printed materials much more readily available to more people. This is also a time of exploration. In 1497, the Cape of Good Hope is rounded. In 1492, Columbus discovers the Americas. And in 1522, Magellan circumnavigates the globe. Then we move on to what's called the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. This begins the Protestant Reformation in about 1517, and this began with the posting of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And what happens here is it's reflecting the culture of the time, this eroding faith in both the Catholic Church and the role of the Pope. And we'll talk about this again in more detail. The Counter-Reformation, this was actually the church's response, trying to get people back into the church. And then we have the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. This is about the later 1600s into the 1800s, into the time period of Romanticism. Here we're going to see man moving even further away from the church. This is the time of the Scientific Revolution. It is the time of the Industrial Revolution. The idea of natural law develops, and this is that there are rules that govern the world, and some that they were an inherent part of the earth, such as like gravity, things such as this. During the Enlightenment, we'll talk about moving from a geocentric universe to a heliocentric universe. In Asia and China, this is a time of great prosperity under the Ming Dynasty from 1368 to 1644. The government provided public works that helped many citizens. This includes water, jobs, roadways, and it was a time of great stability in China. However, it did eventually end by rebellion. In India, for the 16th and 17th century, it was ruled by the Mughals, who were the Mongolian descents of Muslims. India also enjoyed a time of political stability and flourishing economic activity, leading to a flourishing artistic climate at the time. In India, there were attempts to widen the empire by the aristocracy, and these were unsuccessful and put much stress on the peasants, and eventually leading to unrest. In Japan in the 17th century, we're going to see the rise of the samurai. This was a warrior class who became a higher class serving important roles. And then in Japan, the population actually tripled to over 30 million individuals. In the 18th century, the Japanese society became much more urban, and we saw a strong middle class that developed. Most of these were merchants. And then also at this time, we saw the arts flourishing. And this is the time period where we're going to see the rise of the kabuki theater. And then in Africa, we're starting to see a rise in the European presence. We're going to see a clash between Christians and Muslims all fighting for control of this area. And then this is also where we're going to see the beginning and the rise of the slave trade. And then with the discovery of the Americas in 1492, this idea of this new world. However, we all know from history, this wasn't a new world. There were people there at the beginning. In the 16th century, the Spanish dominated the area. The Aztec Empire, which was a dominant force, it would not form alliances with others. They believed they were the chosen people. And this is also the time of the Incan Empire. And these were both eventually destroyed by the Spaniards. All right, so for this lecture, these are the different artistic styles you'll need to know. The early Renaissance, High Renaissance, Mannerism, Baroque, and the Enlightenment. And within the Enlightenment, we'll look at two artistic styles, the Rococo and the Neoclassical. So let's start with the early Renaissance. What we're going to see again in the early Renaissance, this starts about 1400 and it centers in Florence, Italy. And what we're going to see is we're going to see that painting actually begins to flourish with the development of more realistic tools. And we're going to see that in the work here. This is Boccaccio's The Tribute Money, created 1425. It's a fresco in the Bronici Chapel. And what we're going to see here is this much more realistic details within the works, that we're going to see the use of space and perspective to make works look three-dimensional. So here, when you look at this, this is showing a scene of part of the cycle of life of St. Peter. And what we see here with this group of men, this is Jesus and the apostles, how they're standing is much more realistically than we would have seen in the Middle Ages. Think about it this way. If you're standing and looking at a group of individuals, you're not able to clearly see everybody. Well, in the Middle Ages, there had been a practice which was called stacking. And this is where if people were like one standing behind another, instead of showing them realistically, the person behind would kind of be up on top. And that way you could see everybody. Well, what happens in the Renaissance is we see this shift towards this more realistic perspective. Also, we can see the use of atmospheric perspective in the background. You can see we know the mountains are supposed to be further away because they're smaller, they're out of focus. And then you can also see the foreshortening on the right-hand side in the building. This is a technique used in perspective to create the illusion of an object receding very strongly into the distance or the background. So we know from where we're standing, our vantage point, we know this building is going away from us. Also, the individuals are much more lifelike. The clothes, how they're standing in contrapposto, and the figures stand in a more realistic semicircular and not in the straight line, or again the stacking that was popular in the medieval works. Now what we also see within the tribute money, is this is actually three scenes in one. This is from, again, the life cycle of St. Peter, and what we see here is the story where the apostles are going and they want to go into the temple. However, you have to pay a tax or a tribute to get into the temple and they don't have the money. So in the middle scene, we see Jesus, the central figure, and he is telling, you see the tax collector basically saying, I need the money. And Jesus telling St. Peter, go over to the water, catch a fish, and then open its mouth. So then if you look over to the left, you see St. Peter in the water, and he's catching a fish. Well, when he catches a fish and opens the mouth, there's a coin inside. And then so the image on the right-hand side is St. Peter actually paying the tribute money so they can go into the temple. Now, not all works in the early Renaissance were concerned with realistic representations. And you can see that here. This is Botticelli's La Primavera, or the Spring, from 1482. And again, this one is not as worried or concerned with a realistic perspective. Here we can see the figures have strong outlines. But what is he doing here is he's actually using the use of allegory. And so what the use of allegory is that you're showing one thing, yet it's telling a separate story. So here we're seeing La Primavera, which would be the ancient Greek or Roman representation of spring, yet it's also telling a story of the life of Mary. All right, well then probably the most important invention of the Renaissance is in the 15th century, Flemish painters developed oil paint. This radically changed the painting world because it helped painters to achieve realism and perspective unlike anything in the Gothic era. The reason why this happens is that Oil paints actually dry much slower. In fact, if you work with oil paints, they take forever to dry. But because of this, the slow drying period, artists were able to blend and make very bold and bright colors. And they were able to create very fine details, which they were unable to do with the mediums before. Flemish painters used this to enhance chiaroscuro, and it also helped develop more atmospheric perspective. And now we're also going to see this changing role of the view of the artist. An example of this is the image we're seeing here. This is Jan van Eyck's The Arnolfini Marriage, or Giovanni Arnolfini and His Bride. This is from 1434. And it's an oil on panel. And you can see here it's created using the oil paint. So we have very bold, bright colors we've not seen before, and then the finite details that are available in this. And what happens is, I made mention last time that in the Middle Ages, we actually really didn't even keep track of who the artists were. Why? Because they were just the tool, right? The works were the divine inspiration. However, what's happening now is artists and man is getting credit for creativity. And what we see here, this is actually a marriage between the two individuals. And there's a lot of message and meaning in this work itself. The Arnolfinis, he was a wealthy merchant, and we're going to see that in the Renaissance, this rise of this middle class, this merchant class. And so what you see here, again, because usually only the wealthy could purchase portraits to be made. So having this portrait created is showing their status and their wealth. And you can see that through different things throughout it. You can see the shoes on the lower left-hand side, which would represent travel. You can look at their clothing. His cloak, right, it's lined with fur. Her dress, very extravagant detail. And no, she is not pregnant. This actually was the style of the time. And in fact, women would pad that area of themselves to get this silhouette. We can also see, if you look in the window sill and right below, there's oranges. This would be something very hard to come by. So again, it's showing the wealth of the individuals. In the background, you're going to see there's a canopy bed. Now, most people would think, okay, so this means this painting is done in their bedroom. It's actually not. Canopy beds were, again, a sign of wealth, and so this was something people at the time would actually put these canopy beds in their living room, if you will, just to show off the wealth. And then you can see the chandelier, very highly decorated and ornate. And then the dog. And interestingly enough, dogs, when they are represented in paintings, usually mean loyalty and fidelity, especially when they're painted with a female. And that's why we see this, if this is a marriage contract, right? It's showing that loyalty and fidelity. Now, also interesting in this is what we call a double portrait. So when you look in the mirror in the back, if you zoom in, you actually we see the backs of the individuals as they are represented, but we also see Jan van Eyck himself in the painting, and it's showing him painting the painting. And then if you look right above the mirror, you also see these words. And the words literally translate to Jan van Eyck was here 1434. And so this is very important because it's looking at the changing role of the artist. The artist is no longer just the skilled technician to create the work, but here we actually see the artist as a witness to this event. All right, this is also the time of Albrecht Dürer. He was a German artist. We've looked at some of his prints. You'll see more in the two-dimensional chapter. But this is an example. This is a woodcut. It's the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from 1497 to 98. And here we still see some of those medieval superstition, right? The myth of the Four Horsemen. Yet, this is also making a political commentary. So you see the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and look at who they're stampeding, right? They're stampeding and running over the people. However, if you look on the bottom left, he's also making a comment about the fall of the church, because death is actually trampling over the bishop. Okay? And we know these works are Albrecht Dürer's. If you look in the bottom, in the center, you see the AD. That was his signature. You'll find that in all of his engravings and his woodcuts. All right, And then sculpture at the time. Sculpture, again, focused around the 15th century Florence. And what we're going to see in early Renaissance works is, again, this drive for things to be as lifelike, as human-like as possible, or as realistic. So unlike that Greek goal of perfection showing the idealized man, early Renaissance sculptures wanted to represent the individuals. Here we're going to see freestanding statues become popular again. And here what we're looking at, this is Donatello's David. And this was actually the first freestanding sculpture in centuries. And what we have here is with this David, he looks different than other Davids we may know. Why? Because like that the early Renaissance, he's trying to show David as he actually was. And in the biblical story, David is actually represented, is described as a beautiful youth. That's why when you look at this David, he seems much more feminine, not as much muscle tone, because he's supposed to be a younger individual. The other image we see here is Lorenzo Ghiberti's. These are the gates of paradise. These were the doors that were originally for the baptistry in Florence. And each is a relief panel that tells a story, and then it's also surrounded by important figures. Again, just like in Maccaccio's The Tribute Money, you're going to see the perspective and the realisticness is much more lifelike within these. All right, we do have literature at the time. Again, this is an imitation of much of the classics, and we talk about classics, we're talking about the Greek and Roman classics that are making their way back to the Western world. Also very interesting at the time is the text here. This is Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. And what happened is we have a monarchy government, and the lives of Renaissance men and women were that of the courtiers, and this is the upper classes. And basically, you probably heard the term being a Renaissance man. Well, that means that a Renaissance individual should not just be trained in one area, but you should be well trained in many areas. The arts, literature, dance, you should be able to easily converse on a wide variety of subjects. And what happens in the Book of the Courtier is this was basically a guide of good manners and conversations, but it also reflected the Renaissance ideals of intellectual refinement, moral stability, cultural grace, and spiritual insight and social consciousness. And then the architecture at the time. This differed from medieval architecture in three main ways. First, we're going to see the revival of classical models, again referring back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And then we're going to see the application of non-structural decorative details. Think of the Gothic cathedrals. The flying buttresses were very beautiful, yet they were structural details. And what we're going to see here is when we look, this is again the Florence Cathedral, the bottom left images we're looking up in the dome, and that dome is painted. This is just purely decoration. And then the third way is the outer expression. Again, we are going to see that that stability and support that was needed by the flying buttresses is going to go away. The Renaissance architects found a way to hide the supporting elements, so the external appearance was also very beautiful. An example of this is the dome here, Filippino Brunelleschi's Florence Cathedral Dome, which we talked about in the What is Creativity lecture. Moving into the High Renaissance, this is the early 16th century, and this time period is seen as the high point in Renaissance art. Again, here we're very strongly going to see a return to the Greek ideal of an idealized form. We're also going to see a shift from Florence as the center of the Renaissance. We're going to see a shift to Rome. And what happens in the High Renaissance is there's this desire to capture the ideas of classical art, but not to copy it. Idealized forms are now found through mathematical means that define composition and proportions. The belief was that through this we can find this harmonious universe that was found in perfect order. Composition was arranged according to this mathematical order, and composition was closed, meaning it brings your eyes into the work. An example of this is what we can see here. This is Raphael's Alba Madonna, 1510, and it's an oil transferred from wood to canvas. And what you see here, we see Raphael, who became very famous for his images of the Madonna and Child and often baby John the Baptist. And what you can see here is you can see that mathematical influence. influence. First, this is much more natural-like when we look at it. That when we first look at this, we think of mother and child and maybe not Mary and baby Jesus. But you see that mathematical influence if we follow along from the bottom of John the Baptist and we go up along his back to the top of Mary's head. Then from Mary's head, go from there down her back, and then straight across, and you see this very strong equilateral triangle. This is also the time period of some of the great artists of the time. We have Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, Michelangelo, 1465 to 1564, and then again Raphael, 1483 to 1520. Now, this shift from Florence to Rome was largely due to the popes and their support of the arts within the Vatican. What happens is that we're going to see this increase, this attempted increase in the church-sponsored art on a grand scale. Why? Is they're trying to bring people closer to God and back into the church themselves. And we see this in the art in the buildings. For example, in the Vatican. This was started by Pope Nicholas V. And this includes what has now become the Vatican Library. And what happens when we had the Protestant Reformation is that you had, basically the church had been, we saw corruption in the church. That, remember in the Middle Ages, the idea was that, you had to reach salvation. That was how you would get to heaven. And so if you would confess your sins, and then you'd give some sort of penance to do. And once you did this penance, your soul would be clean. Well, what happens in the Middle Ages is this practice developed called the buying of indulgences. And what this was is that instead of having to do this penance, so you commit a sin, you confess it, it's like, okay, well, you can go do A, B, and C. Or you can just buy this indulgence. And it was literally buying of forgiveness. And you can probably guess this led to corruption in the church, that some members in the church saw it as a way to get great financial success. And this is one of the things that Martin Luther objected to in the 95 Thesis, that he literally hammered onto the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. Also, things that he was challenging was the role of the Pope. The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. However, there became in the Middle Ages this idea that the Pope was actually the voice of God, that when the Pope spoke, it was as if God spoke. And Martin Luther claimed, no, that's not true. The Pope is a man, and man is fallible. So a man cannot be the voice of God because God is infallible. And this was one of the things that was challenged. And that's what we see in part of the Protestant faith is a return to the documents and the role of the papacy or of the Pope. The Pope is still the head of the church, but he is just a man. He is a man that is the head of the church, not the voice of God. All right, well, St. Peter's Basilica, Michelangelo became the chief architect after he criticized the original plans. The plan was clear and pure and full of life, and the idea was that it was supposed to represent truth. It was completed in May of 1590, but total completion of the square was not done until 1614, and it reflected many changes. The interior of the dome was also designed by Michelangelo and the original designer Bramante, whose design had been abandoned. Michelangelo claimed that this design was clear, pure, full of light, and whoever distanced themselves from Bramante also distanced himself from the truth. And this is what you can see here. This is St. Peter's Basilica, and you can see in the inside that's the interior of the dome. And then this is St. Peter's Basilica, and this is the courtyard. Okay. All right, again, this is a time of continued discovery. Nicholas Copernicus was wrote on the revolution of celestial bodies in 1543, and this is where he claimed the Earth and the other planets actually revolved around the sun. This was directly challenging church teachings, and many theologians refused to believe it because there was the idea that that would show that the church, meaning God, was wrong. Again, this is also the time of Raphael, who sadly died at age 37, and he became most famous for his paintings of the Madonna and Child, as we talked about earlier. And what also we're going to see at this time, in 1508, Pope Julius II commissions the painting of frescoes within the Vatican Palace. The most famous of Raphael's is in the Stanza della Stagnatoria, which is the room of the signature, and this includes the School of Athens in 1510 to 1511. This is also the time period when Michelangelo is commissioned by the church to come in and paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Now, many people think the Sistine Chapel was completely painted by Michelangelo. That is not true. The ceiling is painted by him, but there's two other fresco scenes depicted. One is by Parmigiano, the other one is by Botticelli. And then Michelangelo's The Last Judgment was actually not commissioned until years later. All right, now this work, this is actually not in your textbook, but this work is very, very important to the Renaissance. Why? Because within this image, we're going to see many of the ideas of the Renaissance. This is The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein the Younger. It was painted 1533, and this is an oil on oak. Hans Holbein the Younger was a German artist, and he became very well known for his portrait work. He was actually friends with the Dutch humanist Erasmus, and from this, Erasmus actually gave him letters of introduction to the English court. Holbein the Younger, in 1536, he became the court painter to Henry VIII. And he got to be so well known because he always made his sitter look very dignified. And this was very good with Henry VIII's temperament, which I'm sure from history you know about. All right, so this painting is often used as an example of showing the Renaissance ideals of faith and reason. This picture shows two wealthy, educated, powerful young men. The one on the left is Jean de Vento. He was 29, and he was the French ambassador to England. Now, he is not a king. People look at this think he's the king. This is not Henry VIII. He is a French ambassador to England. And then on the right actually stands his friend, Georges de Seville, who was the Bishop of Lavaur. And he acted on several occasions as an ambassador to the emperor also. And so what we're seeing with this is, again, we're seeing this portrait, much like the Arnolfini one, where this probably would have been commissioned by the man on the left. And it's showing, this idea of the greatness of the individuals. The men are both looking directly back at the viewer with confidence and with a questioning self-awareness. This is something very new in painting, and in what's done to show the stark individuality of the men. Now, the picture is done in tradition of showing learned men with books and instruments, and these instruments are all very important. The objects on the upper shelf include a celestial globe, showing celestial meaning the skies and the heavens, showing again a growing awareness of the universe. There's a portable sundial, and then various other instruments used for understanding the heavens and measuring time. On the lower shelf, we're going to see a lute, which is the stringed musical instrument, a case of flutes, a hymn book, which is interestingly enough open up to a hymn written by Martin Luther, and then a book of arithmetic for merchants. And this book of arithmetic for merchants, showing again that rising merchant class, has been printed using the printed press. And then we also see a terrestrial globe. This again showing land and exploration. And interestingly enough, if you look at it, how it's laying, it actually shows Rome as the center of the world. Now, these objects together actually represent the seven liberal arts, and that provided the basis for Renaissance education. Now, within this, though, there are certain things, right? This is showing the greatness of the Renaissance. However, certain details also show the darker side of things that are going on at the time. Before we get to that, though, let me comment on a few more things. Again, we can tell these men are wealthy by looking at their clothes. Even the bishop, his cloak is still fur-lined. When we look at the floor here, this marble-laid floor is inline, so very intricate details. The cloth that the objects on the upper shelf are laying on seems Indian influence, again showing travel. And then even the curtain, and that serves as the backdrop. Very rich, very luxurious. But again, so there's this greatness of the Renaissance being celebrated, right? The rise of man, exploration, discovery, new scientific technologies. But we see in here, right, some images of the darker side. If you pay attention, one of the strings on the lute is actually broken, showing discord and disharmony. As I already said, the Book of Hymns is open to a hymn by Martin Luther. Martin Luther, the beginner of the Protestant Reformation. If we pay attention, if you look in the back, look in the upper left-hand corner. You can actually see there's a crucifix up on the wall, yet it's being covered by the curtain, almost making it seem as if man no longer needs religion. And then even the stance of the two men. We have the man on the left representing the state and the man on the right representing the church. This could be shown to see the separation between church and state. And then the most notable figure is on the bottom in the middle here. At first you might have looked at this and was like, well, what is this? This is what's called an anamorphic skull. And what happens is this is meant to be seen from one perspective. If you go, literally put this on your screen and then go to the right side and look up at it, what happens is the skull flattens out. This is actually an optical illusion. And so why did Holbein put this in here? Was he basically just saying, hey, look at my skill? No. What he's doing, this is what's called a memento mori, meaning it's a reminder of death. And the idea in this is that death comes for us all. And it's that idea to remind people that even with all this greatness of the Renaissance and these Renaissance tools, that people are just that. They are human. And death is the great equalizer because it comes for everyone. All right, shifting back, I skipped this slide. Titian also a great artist at the time. He was one of the great Venetian artists of the time, and in Venice what happens is that we discover a new method in painting. Venice, as you know, it's a city on the water, very wet environment, and so it took oil paints an extremely long time to dry there. But what happens is they discover is actually building up of pigment through the use of many glazes. And this gives the painting a warmth and adds depth and richness. And you can see that in the work here. This is Titian's The Assumption of the Virgin, 1516 to 1518, and this is a panel. This is also a very large work. It's 22 feet 6 inches by 11 feet 10 inches, and it's in the Santa Maria Glorioso di Frari in Venice, Italy. And what you can see here is you see how here's Mary, this is where she's ascending to heaven, and the heavens almost seem to glow. And this was done by layer after layer after layer of a glaze, which means it's the paint that has been watered down with either water or a finer oil. And they've actually x-rayed this, and there's up to 30 to 40 different layers of paint within this. Okay. And then also important at the time, we do have the theater, and we see the rise of the theater. We're seeing the theater is actually very popular for upper and middle classes, and this is the time of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, we're just going to briefly mention this. All right, England, late 16th century. And his plays took on more nationalistic flair due to, again, the separation of church and state by Henry VIII. William Shakespeare's death, circa 1564 to 1616, and his first plays were written in the 1590s, and his last plays were 1610 to 1611. Usually they are represented in 3 different categories. The comedies, which include things such as Much Ado About Nothing, A Midsummer's Night's Dream. They often have to do with mistaken identity. We have the tragedies, which look back to the great Greek tragedies, that we have some sort of tragic hero with a tragic fall or flaw that leads to their downfall. This includes Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and the greatest was probably Hamlet. And then we also have the histories. Now these were dramas at events that actually occurred between 1200 and 1550. But what happens is he takes these historical events and he puts a fictitious story behind them. Now, I've included a clip here. This is the soliloquy from Hamlet. And what happens in these soliloquies is this is where the actor, the character, is speaking their thoughts out loud. Why? That way the audience can know and understand the inner thinkings of the individual. And then very famous that you see pictured here was the Globe Theater from 1519 to 1613. There were 3 different levels in the theater. The upper levels cost more, and the cheapest levels were what were called the groundlings. And this was the standing area that was in front of the stage. Now you have to remember at this time the actors were all men. Women were actually forbidden from acting in plays. And Shakespeare himself actually played a minor role in many of his productions. Now, after the Renaissance, we shift into an artistic style known as Mannerism. Mannerism developed about 1527 and lasted till about the 1580s. This was a shortly lived moment. But what happens in this time, again, with the Renaissance? We've been moving further and further away from the church. Man had been looking more to himself for the answers of the universe. Well, what happens in 1527 is Rome, remember the seat of the High Renaissance, was actually sacked by Spain. And this causes a lot of turmoil and disillusionment with many of the Renaissance ideals. So it's almost what I call like a little hiccup in the ideology. This thought was, well, we've been moving further and further away from the church, and look what has happened. Maybe what we're doing is not correct. And so you see this uncertainty, this question, you see this reflected in the artworks of the time, especially in the paintings. What we're going to see is we're going to see works that have very oddly proportioned aspects to them. We're going to see that the individual component often distorts reality. Many times the works will have a very cool color palette or a very bright and almost jarring. Also, we're going to see some of the images that are shown are ones that are classically shown, yet they're shown in a way meant to be kind of upsetting or discerning. Now for us, we're just going to look very briefly at Mannerism, and in fact, we're only going to look at this one artwork. This is Madonna with the Long Neck by Parmigiano, 1534 to 1535, and it's an oil paint on wood. This is also known as Madonna with Angels and St. Jerome. And in here, you can see this very odd proportion. Take a moment and study this. And what happens is you see this very cool color palette, lots of browns, lots of gray blues. But look at the proportions themselves. Let's start with Mary. Madonna with the long neck, let's start with her neck. You can see here the neck is very elongated. It's almost swan-like or serpent-like. Her hands, the fingers on them, also become almost distorted, something you would not see. And then look at the shape of Mary herself. Her legs and hips are very, very large. Her torso is extremely long. Imagine if she actually stood up. She would probably look almost like a bowling pin. And then move on to the baby Jesus, the child on her lap. First off, for a small child, he's very, very large. And then again, the proportions are very off. Look at his legs. Now we know with how he's lying that right leg is further away from us, the viewer, than the left leg. And we've seen this use of perspective used before. But look at the difference between these two legs. So even if the right leg's further away from us, it wouldn't be that much smaller. But look, that right leg is very, very little, and then that left leg is ginormous. If the baby Jesus was to stand up, he'd pretty much tip over. Also, another example, look at the figure on the left. We see that leg sticking out there. Well, whose leg is that? We want to say it's the person, the figure that we see here, the angel, but if it's that angel's leg, then think of how short and tiny that torso is. And then also look at the bottom right-hand corner. Here you see St. Jerome. St. Jerome, if we look at this, is he an actual person? If he is, for the perspective to be right compared to Mary, he's got to be very, very far away. Yet, look at the pillar that he's standing by. For Mary, it actually seems as if the pillar is pretty close to her. Yet that doesn't make sense if Jerome has to be that far away. And then even follow the pillar itself. The bottom of the pillar seems to be close to Mary, but if you follow it to the top seems like it's very far away. And so we see this very odd proportion, this use of perspective in a way that it doesn't quite make sense. And again, this was done very intentionally because it reflects that questioning and that turmoil of the time.